Hello, hello! This month in Biopicked, we read the book My Friends by Fredrik Backman. And if you're new here, my name is Josephine. Biopicked is our book club where we read one book together every month and then come back here to essentially talk about it. We also hang out on Fable, but mostly we talk here. We have a lot to talk about when it comes to this book, so let's get into it, shall we? And just as a reminder, these discussion videos are meant to be full conversations about the book, which also means that they are not spoiler free. So if you haven't read My Friends yet and you want to go in blind, I think this is probably the moment to scooch back over, get yourself a copy, and then read it, and then we can talk later on. And very briefly, what the book is about, a little recap. My Friends follows Louisa, who meets a famous artist and inherits his first painting. This is a painting that is deeply connected to a group of teenagers and their friendships, their lives, and their shared past. Through that painting and through Louisa's journey, the story moves between generations and slowly reveals the lives and relationships behind the artwork. Even saying that feels slightly misleading, I think, because it isn't really like a plot-driven book in the traditional sense. I think it's a book much more interested in memory and relationships and characters and how people shape each other over time. Going into this book, I fully expected it to be emotional, mostly because I've read almost all of Fredrik Backman's previous books, and they tend to make you emotional. Of course, I think this was definitely no exception. I think with Backman's writing, it's special in itself. I think he has his very own unique style that you can very easily say, oh, that's a Backman type way of writing, right? And this is one of those books where I just kept stopping, not to like process the plot or anything, but just because I needed to process a sentence, and I highlighted constantly while reading. I feel like his writing in this book particularly started putting words to feelings that I definitely recognize and can see myself having felt or having dealt with in my life, but I would not have known how to articulate them the way that Backman does. I think he has a very specific writing style where he moves between humor and then heartbreak almost without warning. So a paragraph can feel playful or observational, and then suddenly it lands on something painfully honest about like loneliness or grief or growing up, and you go oftentimes from one to the other in very quick successions, making you feel a lot of things. And I'll be honest, sometimes, especially early on in the book before I got used to it, I found that tonal shift a little bit difficult with this one. I didn't feel the same with his previous books, but I think that one thing that you can say about My Friends in comparison is that it's a lot darker than his previous works. It deals with some incredibly dark topics. There's trauma, addiction, violence, loss, neglect, a variety of different things. We get to encounter someone's lifelong illness. We get to encounter domestic abuse, all these different things. And occasionally the sort of sillier or more lighthearted observations, I kind of felt almost out of place or jarring to me. I really loved his way of taking you on a roller coaster with his words in the past or in the previous books, but I think sometimes just going from childhood trauma to like fart jokes could become a bit too much for me, or it made me feel some kind of dissonance. And I've been thinking about that quite a lot as I've been processing the book. There was this quote that he used, a line in the book that somehow really stayed with me, that talks about how adolescence has to be both the strongest light and the darkest abyss, because that's sort of how we learn the limits of our world and how we learn our horizons. And when I found that in my highlights, I was thinking that maybe that's actually what he's trying to match with his language. And so when it comes to that, like I see that he's trying to do that, but I felt so uncomfortable at times. And sometimes I was like feeling something in the moment, and then that lightheartedness could pull me out of it. So in a way, I think it's nice. I appreciate it now coming out on the other side of the book. And if we go back to that line that talks about how adolescence has to be both the strongest light and the darkest abyss, I think that line quietly kind of explains the emotional structure of the story. Backman doesn't present teenage years as nostalgic or purely chaotic or like purely beautiful. It's not one single thing. He presents them as as overwhelming in every direction at once. I think adolescence is like a period where friendship feels so life-defining, like they're everything to you. Love is quite indistinguishable from belonging, and pain can feel very, very permanent because you don't yet have the experience to know that things can change. You could live a different life than this. I also think that the book doesn't treat struggle as something that only belongs to adolescence. We see it frequently. It shows that intensity often carries forward, like from your childhood into adulthood. It shows how people grow older but still move through life shaped by things that they experienced when they were very young. There's a moment in the book where Bachman references a quote by Henry David Thoreau. It says that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. I think that idea sits underneath so many of the characters of the story. If you view their life in this town where they're growing up, almost everyone in this book is struggling in some way. Parents are trying their best but still failing their children. There's adults who carry grief or guilt that they don't know how to process. There's teenagers who are just trying to survive environments that don't allow them to feel emotionally or sometimes physically safe. One of the things I found both painful and honest, and something that resonated with me, is how it treats parenting. I think that there was a line in there somewhere that talked about how every parent is doing their best and that almost every parent still fails in some way. And yet, despite how deeply I think the book explores struggle, it never feels completely hopeless, because alongside all the quiet desperation of all these characters, the book keeps returning to something else, which is the idea that what makes those struggles survivable is the people around you. It's the people that you love. So friendships, relationships, moments of connection that happen during the worst period of someone's life, we see it over and over again, how this keeps happening. And the book keeps suggesting that those moments are not small or secondary, that instead they are things that make survival possible in the first place. And I think that's something deeply human. And I think that the book keeps circling back to two different topics. Of course, there's lots to uncover inside of My Friends, but I wanted to talk a bit about friendship and art. So one of the things I kept coming back to while reading the book is how Bachman talks about art specifically. He keeps quoting different perspectives of what art is, and he keeps defining it. This person says that art is this, or this is what art is. We get to see a contrast of people moving through the world seeing art as only of its value, like the richer characters who are wanting to purchase the artist's art, versus the people who are admiring art for something deeper. And I think that the point that Friedrich Bachmann is trying to make there is that art is not just something people make, but actually it's something that moves between people. There's a line in the book that I think captures that perfectly, that art is what we leave behind in other people. Mind you, I read this in Swedish, so if the quotes are not necessarily verbatim, I'm just translating them in my head. But I think that the painting at the center of this story is obviously important. It's a very rare, valuable painting that carries a kind of myth around it, but the book seems almost actively uninterested in treating it as an object. So every time the painting comes up, a story pulls us away from questions of ownership or worth and instead towards questions of meaning. Like what does this art piece mean? Which, whilst these rich people at the beginning of the book, they're just talking about this painting as something that will look good in their summer house. They're talking about how the value will increase if the artist passes away. But when the artist gives Louisa his first painting, I think it could easily be framed in that context, like, oh, this is just an inheritance. If she sells this, she will become rich and her life will change materially. Like, he's just doing this because he noticed that she was living off of the streets and he wants to help her out. But I think that the moment is actually a lot deeper than that, and it feels more like an act of recognition, almost like he's saying, you're actually allowed to want something, you're allowed to make something, you're allowed to really take this seriously. And I think that distinction matters because it changes what art somewhat represents in the story. The painting isn't actually a reward for her and a place for her to have an easier life. It isn't a burden. I think oftentimes they talk about not wanting to have responsibility for this painting because it's too much. It's too much to carry. But I think from the artist's perspective, this is probably encouragement. It's a way of passing something forward rather than leaving something behind after his passing. And once I noticed the line that art is what we leave behind in other people, I think this is like something that you see throughout the entire book. Backman definitely left his art in me because I have engaged with it, I have felt through it, and it's similar with Louisa and the artist in a way. And when you think about it that way, art is not just confined to being a canvas or being something that you find in a museum. It actually becomes relational. It becomes something that's human. It becomes about influence, about how one person's inner world can take root inside another person. And I also find that in this book, art is very closely tied to pain. The artist himself describes himself as living a long life. You get to see his background and what happened throughout his life. And there was a lot of loss, there was some struggle, there was a lot of loneliness. I think there was even a line that said that life is long but painful almost the entire time when you have to live it alone. That was something I highlighted, and it really stayed with me because it suggests kind of, and we already know this, a lot of people create art not in spite of suffering but often because of it. And art becomes a way of not being alone with what you've lived through, especially for Louisa's character. She found this postcard and it was often her solace through really difficult times for her. What I also found interesting is how the book contrasts how people talk about art with how they actually experience it. And I think this ties back to what I was saying before, that people are really impressed by the artist's fame. They're drawn to the status and the story behind him. But they're often much less interested in the human cost behind the work. They talk about the artist almost like he isn't a person anymore. The book is poking at this hypocrisy, how people are more comfortable admiring someone's suffering once it has been transformed into something that's beautiful and distant, and like even if it's actually even better if he's passed away because then this has a different value, right? I think there was another part that really struck with me that said that death is a public thing, but dying is private, and the last truly private thing we have. I think it's the artist that says this fairly early on in the book. And I think art sort of sits somewhere in between these. Like, it makes something really private visible, but it's never fully explainable. Like, to a random stranger and to Louise at the start of the book, she might have been very perceptive in seeing that there were 3 children on a pier. You can't fully access the life that produced it or the full thought process behind that painting. I think this sort of mirrors also how our relationship to the artist in the book. I think the book never fully tries to explain this character. He isn't like a list of achievements, and he exists mostly in the story through how he affects other people, his relationship to Ted mainly, and the other friends. And what I love about this approach is that it mirrors how we actually experience art in real life. Most of the time, art doesn't change us because we understand it perfectly. It changes us because it recognizes something in us. So there can be, as someone who reads a lot, like there's lots of things that you can take away from a book without taking away everything. And I think it taps into a feeling that we didn't know how to name, and then suddenly you feel less alone with it. I think it's definitely the way that Backman writes. Like, so many lines in this book allowed me to access a feeling that I had and put words to it, or put something to it, put an image to it that I hadn't had before. And I think that's what's so wonderful about art. The Louisa's relationship to the painting feels kind of like she inherits not just the painting, but permission to create, permission to want something more, permission to continue a conversation she didn't necessarily start. And in that way, art in My Friends becomes this quiet through line between people who never fully share the same time or space, but still really manage to touch each other's lives. And another thought I had while reading this book is, of course, how Backman writes about adolescence. I had not thought about my own adolescence in so long, to be honest, but I think he did a really great job in capturing what being a teenager can sometimes feel like. One thing that struck me or resonated with me was how it portrayed teenage friendship. One of the lines that I've highlighted said that when you're 14, friendship and being in love doesn't feel separate. It's the same feeling. It's light from the same stars. So maybe there should be a better word for it, I think is the gist of that sentence. And I definitely felt that way when I was 14. My friends to me were my biggest loves. And when I later fell romantically in love with someone, I can recognize that the intensity of that was the same as I felt for my friends when I was 14. I think the friends in this story particularly, they don't just know each other, they also know each other sometimes without words. They recognize each other without explanation, and sometimes their recognition is almost too much to carry for each other, because when someone sees you that clearly, they also see your fear, your shame, your longing, what you're going to get up to, all these things that you are also trying to hide from yourself. These friendships in the book, the friendships between the teenagers, it's very loving, but it's also quite fragile. It's described as something almost permanent, like this will never end. But at the same time, they only spent 2 years with one another, and then you see how these people ended up in different directions. I think ultimately what the book highlights is how much power these relationships have over who we end up becoming. And when you're that young, your friends are often the first people who reflect you back to yourself. So they tell you directly or indirectly who you are allowed to be. And that reflection stays with you longer after the friendships themselves change or disappear. For example, Ted's friends were the ones to tell him that he should be a teacher. The artist's friends were the ones encouraging him to paint. There's also something deeply important in how openly affectionate these relationships. They all tell each other in their own way how much they love each other. They are each other's worlds. And that openness feels especially striking to me when you contrast it with the adult world that they are slowly entering, a world that will teach them to kind of suppress exactly those emotions for each other. They live in a world where the adults around them are not able to say I love you, but where they are able to give that to one another. The book is very clear-eyed about how vulnerable children can be. There's a line that says, how should I translate this? Children are so fragile that if you're even the teensiest bit fragile yourself, you're screwed. At least one of you will break. And that sentence feels brutal, but also deeply honest. Like it captures something uncomfortable about how damage can get passed on through generations, and how oftentimes it's someone's unhealed pain that will pass that torch along. I think the book repeatedly shows how adults who are struggling themselves place emotional weight on children who are not equipped to carry it. And for some of these adults, it's unintentional. For some of these adults, for example, you as dad, I guess it's more about control and feeling power over something. The somewhat tenderness of this teenage friendship is contrasted by just how not tender the rest of the world around them is. Alongside this story of friendship and art, there is a much darker thread in this book. Is a story about how boys become men and what that process somewhat demands of them. At one point, there's a line that says, the most dangerous animal on earth is always and has always been a young man. And the most frightening thing about a young man is that until very recently, he was just a boy. And no one warns you when he stops being one. Is almost a thesis statement for the entire violence running through the book. The transformation from boyhood to manhood doesn't happen in a single moment. There's no ceremony, no warning. It usually happens slowly or quietly through expectation, silence, what people around you reflect back to you how your friends engage with the world, right? And I think we see this behavior clearly in the homes that these boys grew up in. In Ted's household, there are very clear rules about masculinity, and in the world around him as well. Like, men shouldn't cry, men shouldn't be weak, men shouldn't be gay. Men should work hard, and you should go down to the harbor and you should drink harder, and men should look the other way when their friend is behaving in a way that isn't okay. It's not until things have gone too far that these men actually admit that they have done anything wrong, right? I think that the book is very good in its depiction of this in particular, and showing how that inheritance between men and boys, how it works. And the book, of course, doesn't just present this violence as something that only affects men. I think it also shows all the scars that it leaves on women throughout the story. And now I have no idea if Fisken is the Swedish name. Is her name the fish in the book? Let me know what her name is in English. But you see all the scars that it left on her. You see scars how it left in Ali, in Joar's mother, in Louisa as a character as well. It's the system of violent men, and a system where emotional repression and silence and loyalty to other men create environments where harm is allowed to continue, and especially towards women. There is this line where Fisken says that kind people are almost the worst, right? Because with cruel people, you at least know where you stand, but it's the people who appear kind initially that can be the most dangerous. And I think that observation feels deeply connected somehow to the book's view of masculinity. This idea that danger often hides behind normalcy, behind politeness, behind things that are socially acceptable. There's also another line where Fisken says that there's nothing more dangerous than being seen by men, despite this irony that men see her all the time. And imagine how unsafe that actually must have felt for her. She's sleeping with I don't know what it is a knife under her pillow. She's sleeping with some kind of weapon to try to minimize men from hurting her. And I think all of these lines, they sit uncomfortably. I think that they're meant to. They force the readers to somewhat confront that gendered violence isn't just about individual bad actors. It's about environments that we exist in, environments that make certain kinds of harm possible or even invisible. If you take Fisken and Louisa, they're growing up inside a foster home system where that violence is allowed to thrive because no one is really looking out for these children. And it's similar inside of Joar's house, where that violence is just allowed to exist because what else can you do? This is your family you're speaking about. I especially just really appreciated the relationship between these four teenagers. They are emotionally open with each other in ways that the adult men around them are not. They do say, "I love you." They protect each other. And they do create a kind of emotional refuge that exists despite the world that they're being prepared for. They hang out in Ted's basement just to find a little bit of refuge from the lives that they have around them. Somewhat in a world that teaches boys to close themselves off, to not be emotional, art becomes a way to express things that can't be said. This is a book with a lot of trauma. Sometimes I was feeling like maybe this is a bit too much. But after finishing the book, I didn't expect the ending to go the way that it did. I was surprised by some of the things happening there. I have let the book land and sit with me for a while, and I actually really, really enjoyed it. I think that there's a reason why these characters have found each other, and it's because like sees like. They keep talking about it, right? We found one of us. This is a story about people with traumatic backgrounds who are drawn to each other and who find each other. But somewhat in the book, I think that the relationship between Ted and Louisa kind of feels almost like a relief or a pause in the story. It allows you to snap out of this very traumatic childhood and just enjoy their relationship, because I think on the surface, Ted and Louisa couldn't seem more different from one another. Ted is controlled, cautious, he's shaped by rules, and he cares about responsibilities. He moves through the world as someone who is constantly trying to not take up too much space, and he doesn't want to see things wrong. He doesn't want to alert attention. And Louisa feels like definitely the opposite of this. She feels allergic to rules. She doesn't care much for fitting in. She never did anyway, right? She doesn't always seem to understand social expectations or what's, according to Ted, proper or not. And she moves through life with a kind of defiant freedom. Yet the book kind of slowly reveals that beneath those differences, they are meeting each other in somewhat the same emotional place. They are more similar than what you would think. First of all, they both carry grief. They've just lost someone that was very, very dear to them. And they both share this fear of not being alone, but being abandoned or being left. I think there's a line that captured this perfectly. As an adult, he has often thought that it's a lie that people are afraid of being alone. What we're actually afraid of is being abandoned. You can choose to be alone, but no one chooses to be left. Both Ted and Louisa reason like this. They also want to run away the second they feel that they're responsible for someone else's well-being, because they really don't know how to be there and show up. Both of them, I think, would rather choose solitude than risk being rejected. So they both would rather leave first than experience the humiliation and pain of being left behind. And I think they kind of circle around this, both of them in the book. They find each other and then they hesitate and they connect and then they pull away. They try to leave each other but don't really know how to do that. And it sort of somewhat strengthens their relationship and shows like, I can't just leave this person behind. And Ted is probably my favorite character in the book, partly because he has this grumpy, I don't care vibe, but the story keeps proving him to be the opposite. Like, he cares about everything constantly. He just shows it not necessarily through words, but also through action. However, he is very vulnerable and is the person who oftentimes does say the vulnerable thing. And I think he takes responsibility for people around him in a very physical, very literal way. He is injured because he jumps in between his student and a knife, and he runs after Louisa and ends up getting beaten up. He moves in with the artist and then takes care of him and does everything he can for him in his final years. Over and over, Ted puts himself in the line of fire for others. I think not because he's trying to be a hero. He doesn't really have those types of motivations, but because he can't not do it. It's like almost a compulsion to have him take care of others. And we talked a bit about masculinity, and I kind of love how Ted's character connects to that. He challenges the masculinity that he's surrounded by. He doesn't necessarily look away and swallow things and just keep going. He is soft, but not in a performative way. Like, he's vulnerable in a way that only he knows how. Like, he shows up for others. I think that vulnerability is life-changing for pretty much every character in this book. Great example, and something that I really liked, was his brother and their interactions with another. His brother is really that representation of that masculine guy who has to push his brother down the stairs and takes it too far and spends time around someone who is really not a good person. And I think that's why, like, Ted being brave enough to sit down in a rare vulnerable moment and ask him why he is friends with this person actually like brings him out of it and changes how his brother starts to see his future. Like, he walks away from that friendship and ends up missing the party where those former friends later get arrested. I think that's why I really like Ted. He really affects people. He supports them. He carries them with him. He stays loyal to them, even while acting like a grumpy man who doesn't really want to care. And from what I've seen in some of Backman's previous characters, this is such a Backman character. Looking at interviews with Backman himself, like, maybe this is the Backman of the characters, you know? I feel like he wrote some of himself definitely into Ted. And my final reflection is that this is Ted's story. You could even argue that it is Ted's love story to the artist. I was circling back to my highlights after finishing the book, and I found this line that I'd highlighted it but then not thought about it so much after. And it said, that it's a silly thing that the person that you're in love with, you almost never say the name of. And it's just so clear to you that it's you who I'm talking about. It's you I'm always thinking about. Who else? And I thought about how when Ted talks about the artist, he's always just the artist. He's never really named. He does get named towards the end of the book, but that's not by Ted, it's by Joar. And Louisa is kind of like surprised. Like, what do you mean that's his name? Which kind of makes sense because from Ted's perspective, it's always obvious who he's talking about, who he's thinking about. You kind of go into this book thinking Louisa is the main character. It starts off that way, but I think the more the story unfolds, the more it becomes a story about Ted, about his friendships, his relationships, the choices he makes, and the way he keeps showing up for other people. So when the book ends with Ted wondering what someone like him would even write a story about, I mean, that's not a rhetorical question because this is his book. The book has already answered that question. And I quite liked that meta way of ending the book. All in all, I loved this read. I gave it 5 stars, will recommend it to anyone. But more importantly, how did you feel about the book? Did you like it? What did you not like? You need to leave comments in the description and tell me. If you have read the book with us, I genuinely want to hear what you took away from it and whether your perspectives shifted as the story unfolded, because mine definitely did. I think whether you liked it or whether you're not, both sides are definitely welcome, and I can definitely see how there are aspects of this book that wouldn't be for everyone. So I would love to hear those perspectives as well. Tomorrow, we're announcing our February book, what we're gonna read. And if you wanna join in and read it with me, you can find the Biopicked Book Club on Fable. There, everything is sort of spread out across the different chapters, so you can discuss a specific chapter without spoiling it for anyone else. You can also participate in other discussions, and we will read together there throughout the month, share some highlights, etc. But of course, we also do streams. So once a week, there's a live stream, a reading sprint where you can come in and hang out. Get excited for tomorrow because I am. Thanks for spending time with this one, and I'll see you in the next read.